Hi, folks. This is Abel James, and thanks so much for joining us on Fat Burning Man, where we talk about real food and real results. Today's fun fact of the day: up until 2012, Starbucks used cochineal extract as red food coloring in 6 menu items. It's an ingredient made from crushed cochineal beetles and boiled in ammonia. Sounds good. All right, so this week's show is with a very often requested guest. His name is Chris Masterjohn, and he certainly knows his stuff. Before we get there, I have a quick announcement. I'm actually teaching a class completely unrelated to fat loss or health on how to upgrade your productivity with Ryan Lee, Brian Johnson, John Lee Dumas, Ari Meisel, and many, many more rock stars of getting things done. I'm doing that for in Theos, and Brian Johnson is the guy behind Philosopher's Notes. I've talked about that a few times on the show. I'm a big fan. So it was really cool to have him on, all these experts on, to talk about something more in the business space, which is, another world that I come from and have a lot of fun playing in, to talk about productivity and how you can kick butt. So if you'd like to know more about that, then go to fatburningman.com, enter your best email address, and sign up for the newsletter, and I'll point you right to it. If you're a nerd like me, you're going to enjoy this week's show with Chris Masterjohn of The Daily Lipid, which I think is just one of the best names of a blog ever. We're going to be talking about why hexane is in our food, how to manage inflammation in your body, why you should avoid corn oil at all costs, and how to get all the nutrients you need to thrive. All right, let's go hang out with Chris. All right, folks, really excited to be here with a fan favorite. Mr. Chris Masterjohn is the man behind the most terrifically named blog of all time, The Daily Lipid. Chris has his PhD in nutritional science, is a frequent contributor to the Weston A. Price Foundation journal, Wise Traditions, and is an all-around brainiac. What's cooking, Chris?
Thank you so much for having me on, Abel. Although I have to say, my blog is sort of misnamed because I feel like I'm just delivering lots of broken promises by the title, which seems to imply that I should have something come out every day. And it definitely doesn't do that. So.
That's all good. As long as you're eating and talking about fat every day and living it, I think we're good. And this is actually something that I'm struggling right now because I'm writing a book. And fat is something that, just as a word, is so problematic, right? Like, I wish that there were another word in the English language that were as cozy and comfortable and short as the FAT, but like lipid doesn't quite do it. And a lot of
triglyceride
definitely doesn't do it. But fats are awesome. And I feel like no matter how much we talk about that, people don't really get it. Let's talk about how great fat is for a second.
Okay, sure. Well, fat is awesome in many ways. I mean, obviously, too much body fat isn't something we want.
That's the problem, right? Because like people think of like getting fat and that's bad, but like fat itself.
Sure, but
awesome.
Even body fat has a bad rap. I mean,
Right.
People don't appreciate how much body fat contributes to the nice curves in a woman's body, or even to the cuddleability of a man.
Yeah.
So even in those cases, we want to strike the right balance.
Sure.
But beyond body fat, fat in our food's very important because it's delicious, it's nutritious in a number of ways, both by carrying fat-soluble vitamins and also by assisting the absorption of fat-soluble vitamins from other foods. So if you eat a salad, for example, you are eating a lot of vegetables that have a lot of nutrients, some of which are fat-soluble, and we're not going to absorb those fat-soluble nutrients from the vegetables unless we add fat to the salad. So fat in our diet is important both to nourish us, to make the food taste good, to make the food satiating so that we feel like we've eaten enough, and to help us get nutrition from other foods.
So what are your favorite fats?
My favorite fats to add, you mean, to the diet?
Sure, yeah.
My favorite fats would be, well, first of all, we have to start with the fats related to reproduction because it's very important to nourish our young, and therefore fats like butterfat and egg yolks happen to be some of the most nutritious fats because butterfat is a component of milk, which is meant to nourish a young animal, and egg yolks are a component of an egg, which is meant to become a young animal. And because nutrition is so important in those early developmental stages, those fats are particularly rich in fat-soluble vitamins. Now, of course, the other fats, if we think about the fat of land animals, for example, those are going to be highly dependent on the ways that the animals are raised.
Hmm.
So if you have lard from pigs, tallow from beef animals, chicken fat, et cetera, all these different fats, those are going to be highly nutritious if the animals are raised in the fresh air and sunshine, eating their natural diets, which usually has the major component as grass, in some cases also insects and other things the animal would forage for. And if that grass and those insects and those other foods that are natural components of the animal's diets are raised in very rich soil, that's what's going to be the primary determinant of the fat soluble vitamin content of those fats. And then for uh, animals that are not ruminants, which basically is the animals that are not red meat animals,
Hmm.
so pigs and chickens, for example, are not ruminants. The fatty acid composition is going to be highly dependent on what the animals are eating. And so if those animals are fed a lot of grains and vegetable oils, it's going to be the fat's going to be a lot closer to what we would expect from new modern oils like soybean oil and safflower oil and corn oil and so on. Whereas if you look at pigs and chickens that are raised in the Pacific Islands, where a coconut is a major part of their diet, their fat actually looks a lot like coconut fat.
Hmm.
So with those animals, it's especially important that they're eating their natural traditional diets, because if they're not, not only is the fat less nutritious, but it also is less reflective of what we would consider a traditional and high quality fatty acid composition.
Hmm.
Now, there are also plant oils that I think are very good. There's coconut oil and cocoa butter and red palm oil. Those are good fats from the tropics. More temperate regions, we have olive oil. I really like macadamia nut oil.
Hmm.
And there are some other oils that I would say are kind of in between that are pretty traditional, like peanut oil, for example, sesame oil. And what I would want to avoid are the very modern oils like corn oil, cottonseed oil, and soybean oil and canola oil and things like that.
Would you mind talking a little bit about corn oil? Because I think a lot of us in the ancestral community are very familiar with this, but some people listening might not be. How do you get oil out of corn?
Sure. Well, since you want to talk about corn oil, I should let everyone know that on my personal Facebook, I updated my life status 2 days ago to Chris Masterjohn started cooking everything in corn oil. And I updated my public Facebook page to saying I now recommend
I saw.
avoiding all raw foods and cooking everything in generous helpings of either corn oil, sunflower oil, or safflower oil, avoiding the high oleic varieties and using the highest heat possible, both to destroy the irritants in the cooked foods and also to make sure that the highest amount of these nutritious oils gets into the food. Because when you heat the food, you not only cause a variety of changes to the fat that, of course, are beneficial, but you also get a lot more of that fat stuffed into the food. And of course, the reason that I published these 2 days ago is because it was April Fool's
Right.
Day.
Yeah. How much hate mail did you get for
This is really bad advice for a number of reasons.
that?
So I'm not really an expert on how they make vegetable oils.
Sure, but
There
why
are
is it?
some
Let's talk
videos
about
on
why is it
YouTube.
bad?
There's a good one on canola oil, I think, which is probably a similar process
Yeah.
on that show. I think it's How Things Are Made or something like that.
Yeah, that is
And you can
gnarly.
find that on YouTube.
Hmm.
But in general, if you have a really small seed, it's kind of hard to press it by, olives, for example. You can just squish an olive.
Hmm.
You can put a bunch of olives in a vat and stomp on the olives and squeeze oil out of them. Coconut oil, it's relatively easy to squeeze. I mean, it's a process, but
Hmm.
you don't need a highly industrial setup to squeeze the oil out of a coconut. But in the case of corn and especially cotton seeds, I mean, compare cotton seeds are very small.
Hmm.
These things generally, not only do you need a very highly industrialized process just to squeeze the oil, but you also need some kind of solvent to get uh, the full oil out of the leftover meal.
Hmm.
So I'm actually not sure exactly how the different oils differ. I know with soybean oil, it's almost always extracted with hexane. I'm
Hmm.
not sure about corn oil,
Yeah.
just because corn oil is not that popular anymore anyway.
Right.
I mean, it's still used, but soybean oil is actually really popular, and almost all of the soybean oil on the market is extracted with hexane.
Hmm.
And
Yum.
then it's refined and bleached and deodorized. I don't know too much about those processes in the level of technical detail,
Yeah.
but in general, the higher the post-processing after the solvent extraction, the more likely the hexane is to have evaporated. Of course, it's really toxic to inhale it. But we've, in my laboratory here, I shouldn't say my laboratory, but laboratory I'm working in
Sure.
here, we have done some analysis of soy-based foods, and it definitely seems like there's residual hexane in a lot of those.
Mm.
Uh, so anyway, it's kind of a nasty process. You can avoid a lot of the uh, issues with organic solvents if you look for cold pressed oils.
Hmm.
It's a lot easier to get some other cold pressed oils rather than cold pressed soybean oil, but you still have problems with those oils. First of all, they're not very nutritious compared to traditional animal fats,
Hmm.
or compared to some of the tropical plant oils, like palm oil, for example, is very high in vitamins. And also just the fatty acid composition, the natural fatty acid composition of these oils, very high in polyunsaturated fatty acids. And those are something that we need, but not necessarily something that we want a lot of.
Hmm.
And if you have a human that eats a low fat, high carbohydrate diet and is forced to synthesize all of her or his own fat from the carbohydrate, that human, like most other mammals, will synthesize a mix primarily of saturated and monounsaturated fatty acids. And that's because those are the fatty acids that we most need.
Yeah.
So we don't necessarily want to eat a high fat diet, forcing ourselves to consume a lot more polyunsaturated fatty acids than we would ever be able to our own or get from the traditional oils that have always been parts of our diets. And then there's one worse thing about corn oil compared to, say, soybean oil or canola oil.
Hmm.
Corn oil and the non-high oleic varieties of safflower oil and sunflower oil. So if it says on the ingredients just safflower oil and doesn't say high oleic safflower oil, those oils are almost exclusively, at least in their polyunsaturated fatty acid or PUFA content, omega 6.
Hmm.
And so with soybean oil or canola oil, these are not good oils, but you do have some omega-3 in there, and you might have a reasonable ratio, say 7-to-1 or 10-to-1. Whereas with corn oil or safflower oil, you're looking at something like 140-to-1.
Yeah.
So it's very easy to become deficient in omega-3s from eating those extremely high omega-6 oils like corn oil.
Which are also pro-inflammatory, and which wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing if you were having a little bit of it and it came attached to a bunch of nutrition. But I think, to summarize what you're saying, you're basically just getting a blast of highly inflammatory omega-6s in addition to, potentially leftover hexane and the after effects of being
Well, I want
degummed and
to, since you brought up inflammation,
Sure.
I want to inject something here.
Please.
So one of my pet peeves is when people try to talk about pro-inflammatory things being bad and anti-inflammatory things being good,
All right, let's
because I
rant on
feel
that.
like inflammation is an essential process that is the reason that we're all alive today, and I think it gets a bad rap. And I think if you want to be pro-inflammatory or anti-inflammatory, you are taking sides in a
Mm.
homeostatic balance that you don't understand. And
Ooh.
homeostasis is all about balance.
Hmm.
And so if your body's not trying to take sides, I assure you that. And if you're trying to take sides in that war, uh, we should reflect a little bit about that. And so, but, back in the 1990s, for example, where a lot of the ideas were developed about omega-6 fatty acids being inflammatory and omega-3 fatty acids being anti-inflammatory,
Hmm.
we did not understand that when inflammation stops, there is an active process of resolving the inflammation. All we knew was you could initiate inflammation, and then we kind of thought that it's supposed to just dissipate.
Hmm.
And if it's not dissipating, it's because we have too many pro-inflammatories. And the focus of omega 3s being anti inflammatory was on EPA, which is a fatty acid that's especially high in fish oils,
Hmm.
being able to inhibit the initiation of inflammation by basically interfering with the metabolism of arachidonic acid, or AA, which is the corresponding omega 6 fatty acid. So the thought was that if since arachidonic acid is the omega 6 fatty acid that's used to initiate inflammation, what we want to do is get enough EPA to block that function.
Hmm.
And the nonsteroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, meaning most over-the-counter anti-inflammatories and some prescription anti-inflammatories, are all based on blocking the enzymes that metabolize arachidonic acid to these supposedly pro-inflammatory molecules that initiate inflammation. So all of this focus was on interfering with the initiation of inflammation, and all those things were called anti-inflammatories. And now this is the school of thought that high-dose fish oil came out of,
Hmm.
because the high-dose fish oil is supposed to supply enough EPA to block the function of arachidonic acid. And what the high-dose fish oil is doing is essentially the exact same thing as the over-the-counter anti-inflammatory drugs. When you take it, now those fatty acids you want in small quantities, and that's a nutritional effect.
Hmm.
But when you're taking high-dose fish oil, you're relying on a pharmacological effect that's essentially the same as taking over-the-counter anti-inflammatory drugs. Now, the problem with that is uh, over-the-counter anti-inflammatory drugs, or COX inhibitors, are that's not all of those drugs, but the bulk of them are COX inhibitors.
Sure.
COX is the enzyme that metabolizes arachidonic acid. Anyway, those are all tied to, especially to digestive distress and to some degree to autoimmune disorders.
Hmm.
And we also know, going back to the 19th century, that cod liver oil, which is a form of fish oil that happens to be very rich in fat-soluble vitamins, was very helpful when used in small quantities, but when used in huge quantities could also lead to severe digestive problems and possibly to some autoimmune disorders.
Hmm.
Very similar side effects between the over-the-counter anti-inflammatory drugs and high doses of marine oils. So why is that? Well, in the past decade, what we've discovered is that inflammation resolution is an active process that the body deliberately engages in. And there are two raw materials used for the process of resolving inflammation. The first is arachidonic acid, the supposed inflammatory bad guy.
Sure.
Again, the COX enzymes, the ones that are inhibited by so-called anti-inflammatory drugs, those enzymes metabolize arachidonic acid during inflammation resolution in order to resolve inflammation. So what we now know is that these over-the-counter so-called anti-inflammatory drugs interfere with the initiation of inflammation and interfere with the resolution of inflammation. And the same is probably true of the high-dose fish oil, which is designed to mimic the effects of those drugs.
Hmm.
So by being anti-inflammatory and deciding that instead of helping the body resolve inflammation, we're going to be against an essential body process, we've also forced ourselves against the essential body process of resolving inflammation.
Hmm.
And what that means is that when we rely on these drugs or pharmacological effects of foods that are used in unreasonable doses to mimic the effects of those drugs, is that we interfere with the process we wanted to interfere with, and then we interfere with processes that we didn't even know about.
Yeah.
And the result is that we end up with more inflammation using the anti-inflammatory drugs because we didn't understand that starting inflammation is a good thing when it's targeted correctly,
Hmm.
and resolving inflammation is a good thing. So I think what we want to focus on is providing the body with all the raw materials that it needs to both initiate, correctly target, and resolve inflammation, and taking away any possible inhibitors of the body's natural processes in doing that. So I think what we want is the omega-6 fatty acid arachidonic acid, which is found especially in egg yolks and liver,
Hmm.
to a lesser extent in uh, other terrestrial animal fats, especially if they're actually just to a lesser extent in other terrestrial animal fats. And we could also synthesize to some degree from plant oils.
Hmm.
And then we also want DHA, which is an omega-3 fatty acid that also is critical in the resolution process for inflammation. And that's found to some degree in fish oils and other marine fats, and also in other terrestrial animal fats, especially if they're grass-fed. And again, we can synthesize a little bit from plant oils. But we also want to get rid of these drugs like COX inhibitors, the
Hmm.
over-the-counter so-called anti-inflammatory drugs. And we also want to get rid of approaches like high-dose fish oil, where we're consuming way more than we would otherwise consume of those fatty acids in the diet. And then finally, I think we need to clear up our language a little bit
Hmm.
and stop talking about things as pro-inflammatory and anti-inflammatory. Stop talking about inflammation like it's a bad thing,
Yeah.
and instead start talking about how can we get the body to naturally regulate, correctly target that process of inflammation.
Very cool. Thank you for that. So I'm sure a lot of people are.
Thank you for listening to me. That was long-winded.
So I'm sure a lot of people now, and this happens all the time. This is one of the things that always makes this process so exciting, of learning more about nutrition and biochemistry and the rest of it. I think a lot of people felt like they had omega-3s kind of figured out at this point, and how
Oh,
to
yeah.
work that out with omega-6s and what to eat, how to supplement. Now you've probably screwed all that up for a
Oh,
lot of people
yeah.
who are listening. Where does that leave us? What are you eating? How often? And how are you supplementing, or how should you?
Sure. So I think, I mean, my general rules for eating are: first rule, get rid of all the junk food,
Hmm.
or get rid of most of the junk food. But I don't think that means don't eat anything that tastes good, or don't ever eat desserts.
Yeah.
But I think if you can try to make your own desserts out of natural foods, use natural whole food sweeteners like honey, raw honey if it can be used, if it's not a cooked dessert, or even unrefined sugars and things like that.
Hmm.
I think that would be really good. And of course, you want to moderate the desserts, but you don't want to go gung ho and deprive yourself of
Sure.
pleasure. But you want to pursue a balance too. So I think not every meal should be some gourmet meal where you're mixing every possible palatable thing that you can find in every spice to make it as delicious as possible.
Hmm.
I would say eat a balance between more utilitarian foods and more gourmet foods. Eat more well prepared, really, really palatable and tasty gourmet dishes with desserts when you're with other people and you have
Hmm.
social functions. And if you're just getting up in the morning or you're eating lunch when you're working, use a more utilitarian, simple approach to what you're eating. I would say, eat, uh, eat tend towards eating several balanced meals per day.
Hmm.
Most people are probably going to do best on 3 balanced meals per day. That should always include some protein, some fat, and some carbohydrate. Don't go to extreme gorging on one or the other of those. Don't
Yeah.
go to extreme restrictions on one or the other of those.
Hmm.
I know some people really like intermittent fasting, but just like exercise, fasting is a stress.
Hmm.
And stress, like inflammation, is not a bad thing. It's all about how you deal with it
Right.
and how much of it you have, and whether the cumulative stress is something that you can rest and recover from
Hmm.
easily. So know your body, and don't, if you feel like you feel good when you're intermittent fasting and it's not stressing your body out, then use it in moderation. But don't force yourself to do it if it doesn't feel right.
Yeah.
And again, don't. And a lot of people say don't snack. I feel like a better advice is, if you are not hungry, don't snack.
Yes.
But some people just have real adrenal burnout, and they need to inch their way toward being able to rest from eating between meals. And for those people, if I think it's better to eat something if not eating is going to interfere with your productivity, interfere with your mood, or interfere with your basic mental functioning.
Yeah.
So if you so never force yourself into an eating pattern like 3 meals a day, or intermittent fasting, or no snacking, or anything like that. If your body doesn't respond well to it. But again, don't take out the potato chips just because you're hanging out watching something on TV, and that's what you hang out. That's what you do when you hang out, watch something on TV.
Yeah.
Only eat because you're hungry.
Yeah.
Same thing with water. Only drink because you're thirsty. If you have a long established habit of gorging on water, then you might want to cut out the water for a few days and try to reclaim your natural sense of thirst. And
Hmm.
then, don't force yourself to not drink something if you're thirsty, but don't drink something out of habit. Drink it because you're thirsty.
Hmm.
So I think following all those rules are really, and cutting out the refined foods, are really the most important things. But then on top of that, I would say try to get rid of the modern oils and use the types of fats and oils we've been talking about today. Try to shift over from factory farmed animal products to grass fed pastured animal products. If you use dairy, try to shift over from regular commercial pasteurized dairy to grass fed unpasteurized dairy, higher quality products. And of course, try to include some liberal sources of really nutrient dense foods, especially try to work in some organ meats, or cod liver oil, for example, it can be a substitute for liver and sunshine if you don't get outside much and you can't tolerate the taste of liver.
Yeah.
But try to work in some organ meats, try to work in some bones, the traditional way that all of our grandparents made soup,
Hmm.
by utilizing the whole animal, the bones, the connective tissue, through soup stocks, and other delicious ways to use those gelatinous ingredients. Those would be my primary rules. I'm sure there's lots of things people could do to tweak
Hmm.
any of those in more specific ways, but I think if you can follow most or all of those ideas, you're probably on a pretty good path towards keeping yourself healthy.
Totally. Now, you mentioned cod liver oil. That's something that I certainly take. Can we talk a little bit about why that's important, and why people
Sure.
should be thinking about it as kind of an interesting thing to include in their supplementation strategy?
Sure. So was cod liver oil has always been used since we've understood nutrition, because it's a highly convenient way to get vitamins A and D. And now that we've understood omega-3 fatty acids is important over the last decade or two, it's also become seen as a source of those omega-3 fatty acids
Hmm.
that we were talking about earlier. Cod liver oil was used, according to John Hughes Bennett, who traveled the world in the 19th century to survey the traditional use of cod liver oil in folk remedies, and also by what he called medical men. It was used time immemorial, he said, in many different European countries. So as far back as the cultural memory could go, cod liver oil had been used. We know in Britain the way it started was in the 1700s. For centuries, they had used the residue of cod livers that were left in barrels uh, that would contain kind of a dirty form of cod liver oil that was used as a balm for the treatment of rheumatism, which is a kind of an umbrella term that we no longer use anymore for connective tissue disorders with autoimmune components. And at the time, they were just all kind of grouped under the term rheumatism. And so it would be used as a topical balm. I don't know if there was good evidence that it was effective, but what happened was this one patient cured herself by deciding to eat her topical balm on two occasions. So she started eating it and her rheumatism went away, and then it came back and she started eating it again and it went away. And so this was at the Manchester Infirmary, and they looked into this, and there was a physician named Percival who basically not in the form of a randomized controlled trial that we would use now, but on more of a case by case basis, compared the effect of eating that bomb to a variety of different what we would call placebos now, and found that it had a unique efficacy, and so he added it to the pharmacopoeia. And thereafter, the infirmary started using 50 to 60 gallons per year, I think it was, of cod liver oil. And that's
a lot of cod liver oil.
yeah, it is. And then in the 1800s, in the mid 1800s, it became known as a treatment for tuberculosis. And the Royal Brompton Hospital, again in England, found that the number of people who deteriorated or died were cut almost in half, and the number of people who completely recovered from pulmonary tuberculosis tripled after they started using cod liver oil as a treatment.
Wow.
Which is, by the way, around the time that the long-term eradication of tuberculosis mortality disappeared, because there was a very long-term trend that began around. Well, we don't have data that goes back much farther. It started going down at least around the time that they started using cod liver oil. We don't know if it was already in decline. But in any case, if you just plot the data, there's a straight line that declines from that time through the mid 20th century. And neither the identification of the bacterium that causes tuberculosis, nor the chemical treatments, nor the vaccine, which was released in Europe but never in the United States. Tuberculosis was eradicated in both cases, with or without the vaccine. But all of those things were introduced way towards the end of that decline. And cod liver oil as a treatment was introduced towards the beginning. So I do think that it probably played a role in that long-term decline. But then in the early 20th century, it became known as a source of fat-soluble vitamins. We didn't know about the fat-soluble vitamins before that, but we knew that cod liver oil could prevent or treat xerophthalmia, which is a vitamin we now know is a vitamin A deficiency disease of the eye, where the tissues lose the mucus-producing cells and the eye becomes dry and vulnerable to bacterial infection, and the combination of secondary infection and the dryness leads to ulceration, which can ultimately lead to permanent blindness if it's not fixed. So cod liver oil prevented and cured that. It also prevented and cured rickets, which is overproduction of undermineralized matrix of bone, and in growing children leads to a deformity of bowed legs. And we now know that that is a result of vitamin D deficiency. So cod liver oil played a critical role in the discovery that vitamins A and D were two different vitamins, because if you heated it, you would destroy its ability to cure xerophthalmia but not rickets. So that was evidence that these were two different vitamins that were preventing and treating these diseases. And then also when they used butter, which was rich in vitamin A and poor in vitamin D, probably because the cows weren't getting a lot of sunshine, they found that cod liver oil could prevent, if it wasn't heated, could prevent or treat both diseases, but butter would only treat the eye disease. So those two experiments were the landmark experiments that gave us the knowledge that vitamins A and D are two totally different things.
Yeah.
Then through the 1920s and 40s, it was found that cod liver oil could almost obliterate the bedside fever that would kill women after they gave birth to children,
Hmm.
radically decrease mortality from measles, and even prevent infectious diseases such as the common cold. And the consumption of cod liver oil increased 25-fold between 1920 and 1940,
Wow.
from 2 million pounds per year imported into the US to 50 million pounds per year. Then, after World War II, we came up with antibiotics. People forgot about preventing infections with
Mm.
cod liver oil, and its memory fell by the wayside.
Hmm.
There was an interesting study of medical doctors in England that found a few decades ago that most of the doctors remembered getting cod liver oil as a child, and none of them knew why. And then more
Wow.
recently, that about a third of doctors remember getting cod liver oil as a child, and none of them knew why.
Hmm.
So the medical people, the people who most understood and promoted cod liver oil just before World War II,
Hmm.
very soon had no idea what its significance was after World War II, even while they remembered getting it as a child. And
Right.
now, even getting it as a child is something that's fading from the memory simply because we no longer understand its benefits. But now it's on a
Yeah.
comeback, as evidenced by you asking me about it on this
Sure.
show.
Yeah, absolutely. And so there are a few options. Blue ice is the one that I know a lot of people in the Weston A price community kind of lean toward. But you mentioned unheated, and a lot of them actually are heated. Other brands, right? And some of the ones that are popping up everywhere. What would you recommend to people who are looking for a solid cod liver oil that's going to help them?
Yeah, right now I'm using the Blue Ice fermented cod liver oil.
Hmm.
There's another new option that's come on the scene called Corganic,
Hmm.
and right now there's some disagreement between people. Theirs is unfermented, the Blue Ice is fermented.
Okay.
So there's some back and forth in different communities about which one is better and so on. I have no interest in taking sides on
Yeah.
that, but I do think that those are probably the two cod liver oils that are high vitamin and minimally processed
Hmm.
that are on the market. And the fermented cod liver oil is closer to what they were using in the 19th century, and the unfermented cod liver oil is closer to what they were using in the 20th century.
Interesting.
It seems like cod liver oil had convincing benefits in the 19th and 20th centuries. So I'm of the opinion that those are probably both very good products.
Hmm.
I'm sure if we studied it a lot more, we'd find out that they have different utilities. But in all honesty, not we need a lot more research on cod liver oil because it was heavily researched until World War II, and then the post World War II era is when all of our scientific
Right.
methodologies and technologies have advanced, and that's also the era where we've completely forgotten about cod liver oil.
Yeah.
So what we really need to do is to bring all the advances in science back to those traditional foods and move forward that way.
Very cool. So we have a little bit of time left. Do you want to? You covered vitamins A and D. Can you get into K a little bit as well?
Sure. So vitamin K is sort of the third synergistic partner of vitamins A and D. There, of course, if you think about the fat soluble vitamins, we tend to talk about them according to their chemical properties, call them
Hmm.
fat soluble. Vitamin E is in there too, but vitamin E functionally is an antioxidant. It's more involved with vitamin C in its function.
Hmm.
A, D, and K have very similar functions. All of them are used as raw materials to tell cells how to express their genes, whether to turn a gene on or off, or up or down. But vitamin K's best known function is actually to activate proteins. And very often, what the case is vitamins A and D are telling a cell, hey, you need to make this protein. And then vitamin K it comes along and activates that protein.
Hmm.
And the end result is if we don't have the raw materials to allow our cells to communicate in response to their environment, they're not going to make the proteins.
Hmm.
But if we don't have the vitamin K activating the proteins are useless anyway. So we need these three to act together in a synergistic partnership. Now, all three vitamins do lots of other things, but where these interactions have been most well studied is in the case of regulating where calcium is distributed in the body.
Hmm.
And so that means that when we have these three together in balance, we're putting calcium into the bones and teeth, into their extracellular matrix where they're providing structural support and also acting as kind of a reservoir that the body can tap into when it needs calcium in other places. Um, but they're staying out of the soft tissues like the kidneys, where calcium deposition can cause kidney stones,
Hmm.
and the heart or blood vessels, where it contributes to heart disease. And when they are in the soft tissues in very small quantities, we also need magnesium to make sure that the calcium is properly stored in specific compartments. Because when calcium is just running freely in a soft tissue cell, then it acts as a signal that causes things like involuntary muscle spasms, or you release calcium deliberately in your muscles when you
Hmm.
contract them. So if that calcium doesn't go back to be stored where it's supposed to be, you'll get involuntary muscle contractions. And something kind of similar can happen in nerve cells, where you get or you get nerve excitability or impulses when you shouldn't.
Yeah.
So magnesium is also a synergistic partner that's helping calcium go where it's supposed to go. But anyway, the last point about soft tissue calcification that we should keep in mind is that when we grow as growing children, our bones are growing from cartilage growth plates. And although the bone is a calcified tissue, the cartilage is a soft tissue. Now, what stops us from growing? It's when that soft tissue, the cartilage growth plate, becomes calcified.
Hmm.
So, preventing the cartilage growth plate from calcifying early is one of the primary determinants of how much a child will grow, or even in utero, whether the face properly develops,
Hmm.
especially in the middle third and to some extent the lower third, so that how broad the cheeks are, whether there's enough room in the palate for all the teeth,
Hmm.
whether you get the proper length of nose. All of those things can be determined by the interactions of these fat soluble vitamins in utero. And
Wow.
then whether the person grows up into a tall person, but not so tall that you have a tall, thin kind of pencil shape,
Hmm.
but a properly tall but also adequately broad person.
Sure.
That ideal shape where we look at someone and we say, "Wow, they look really healthy."
Hmm.
All those and really functional. If you don't have the proper development of the rib cage, you're not going to have adequate defense against respiratory infections. If you don't have the proper development of the nose and the sinus passages, you're going to wind up breathing through your mouth instead of your nose,
Hmm.
which is not good for the quality of air you're breathing, for your stress hormone production. So all of these things are highly influenced by the interactions of these three fat soluble vitamins during childhood development. And then they go on to affect our risk for osteoporosis and heart disease as we get older. And then also through other means that we haven't really discussed, not so much through calcium, the risk of cancer and autoimmune diseases and things like that. So, where are we going to get the vitamin K? Well, there's two kinds. K1 is found in leafy greens, K2 is found in animal fats and fermented foods. In general, I would say that K2 is more effective at doing all the things we've been talking about than K1. But I also think that there's some overlap, and K1 does important things too, and it's the main sources of it. Leafy green vegetables are good
Hmm.
sources of lots of other things.
Yeah.
Also, there's some controversy. There's different forms of K2. MK4, for example, is primarily found in unfermented animal products. MK7 is added to those animal products and also produced in other things like natto, which is a fermented soy food that's popular in Eastern Japan.
Hmm.
My There's a debate about MK4 versus MK7. MK4 is known to have unique functions in the body that are not shared by any other form. That's probably why animal bodies form it exclusively. So I think we definitely need our specific attention paid to it. But at the same time, my opinion is that we know very little about these. It's best to cover all your bases
Yeah.
and just eat a broad selection of all those three categories of foods: leafy greens, fermented vegetable products, and fermented animal products both, and the traditional animal fats, especially when they're raised properly out in the fresh air and sunshine, eating pasture and foraging.
You're speaking my language. I love it. We're out of time, Chris, but before
Awesome.
we go, why don't we tell folks what you're working on now and where they can find you?
Sure. Well, the best way to keep up with all my stuff is to subscribe to my blog, The Daily Lipid. That's at blog.cholesterolandhealth.com. There's hyphens in between the words, so blog.cholesterol-and-health.com. Honestly, if you just Google Chris Masterjohn, The Daily Lipid, that's probably even easier than typing that into the search bar.
Yeah.
You can subscribe by RSS feed or through email. And that's good because even though most of the things that I publish aren't actual posts on the Daily Lipid, I cross-link on the Daily Lipid to everything else I do. So I have another blog, Mother Nature Obeyed, on the Weston A. Price site, but I post that on the Daily Lipid. When I publish articles in Wise Traditions, the quarterly journal of the Weston A. Price Foundation, I post links to those on the Daily Lipid. When I do something like this, I'll post a link to it on the Daily Lipid. So going there is how you can best keep up with all my stuff. If you go to the main site of cholesterolandhealth.com, lots of free information about cholesterol. Very good if you have someone who thinks cholesterol is really bad. Say, hey, check out this site.
Yeah.
And also some special reports where I do charge a fee for the distribution of the report. It's kind of like buying a magazine or something like that, but that has some pretty technical, very detailed articles on essential fatty acids and natural plant toxins that can impair the function of the thyroid hormone. And then, like everyone else who's hip, which is no longer hip to say because it's kind of from a long time ago, but I do enjoy irony from time to time, so I'll use it. So like everyone else who's hip, I'm on Facebook and Twitter. So if you want to catch up with, anyway, yeah. So you can also follow me on Facebook and Twitter. But I post everything that I do there and also add some stuff. And on Facebook, I like to, I hate the word meme. So I'm going to say I post pictures that say things
Yeah.
on my Facebook. But anyway, I suggest if you really want to make sure you don't miss anything, subscribe to my blog because it's easy to miss things on Facebook and Twitter if you're not keeping up with your news feed. And Facebook is always finding ways to make sure that not everyone sees everything unless you give them money. So anyway, you can find me in all those places, but kind of the center of it all is my blog, The Daily Lipid.
Awesome. Chris, thank you so much for coming on. This is fun.
I'll work on my brevity.
Oh, it's all good. Everyone was taking notes frantically the whole time, I'm sure. Thanks so much for coming on. I would love to have you on again soon.
Awesome.